ScotWeek is a non-profit 501c3 created in Los Angeles, the entertainment capital of the world. ScotWeek's mission is to celebrate and perpetuate the very special relationship between Scotland and the United States, as well as modern Scottish culture combined with traditional Scottish history. ScotWeek was created to shine a spotlight on Scottish contributions not only in the U.S., but throughout the globe, by highlighting Scotland's rich history of art, music, film and television, business and innovation, travel, food, and drink. As a charity, ScotWeek provides educational and internship opportunities through our partnerships with the Scottish Business Network, Entrepreneurial Scotland, and the Saltire Foundation, all with the support of the Scottish Government. In this series, we'll go behind the scenes of entertainment and industry as we interview our favorite members of the Scottish community. Get a first-hand look at the cultural contributions of the Scottish diaspora, and travel with us around the world on an exciting journey to experience all things Scottish.
Hi, I'm Cindi McIntosh.
And I'm Kelsey Deanne.
And this is ScotWeek.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Kelsey, tell us a little bit about our guests.
Lynn McCloghry and Frasier Grier. And they are on our UK-US immigration panel on how to navigate our special relationship. Because as you know, the majority of the founders of America were Scottish, and Britain and the US have always had this special relationship. And we want to, especially now with the pandemic and moving forward, just get a little bit more deep insight into what's going on now and into the future for US to UK immigration and vice versa. So who wants to start? Let's see. Well, Lynn, tell us about how has COVID affected UK and US immigration and moving into living and working in the UK and the US?
Sure. So thanks very much for having me. I'm delighted to be a part of Scotland International Week and working with ScotWeek as well. So thank you. Thrilled to be here. So I think we've actually got a good news story. Would you believe in such dire testing times? The UK has remained open for business since the beginning of the pandemic. So business tourism is still happening, albeit there are restrictions once you're in the UK. But in terms of immigration and migrating to the UK, there have been delays, obviously, with processing times, as the Home Office, which is our government agency tasked with immigration, there have been delays with them just adjusting to remote working and whatnot. But applications are still being processed, and the Home Office has actually embraced technology, which is fantastic. So ordinarily, if you were sitting in Scotland and you wanted to extend your visa, the last part of the process would be to submit your biometric data at a visa application centre or biometric centre. But obviously they're at reduced capacity, so people can now upload their biometric information on their cell phone, on their mobile device to complete that process. So the Home Office is embracing technology to speed things along. And the Home Office actually at the very beginning of COVID really made a clear commitment to migrants who are in Scotland and the UK by saying that nobody should be disadvantaged if you're stuck in the UK and you cannot extend your visa or apply for a visa or leave the UK. So there's a clear commitment from the Home Office. And in fact, in quite a historic move by the Home Office, they introduced a variety of concessions. So, for example, if you were an American and you visited Edinburgh at the beginning of March, at the beginning of lockdown, and you couldn't leave, you wouldn't actually become an overstayer if you were unable to leave. So they have introduced other concessions, like you could switch your visa category, which you wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. You've also been able to automatically extend visas, and there have been concessions on waiving immigration fees for NHS workers, for example. So there's a lot of good things happening. And then just to give you an idea of processing times, So for example, if you were applying for a passport renewal in Scotland, they're still coming back in about 3 weeks. If you're applying for a sponsored license, you're getting a decision in about 10 working days. And it'll be interesting to hear what Frasier has to say, because I'm sure it's very different in America. So things are still happening. And especially if you're an American and you're wanting to go to the UK, all of the biometric centres are open. The priority service is still operational. So if you're willing to pay a little bit extra money, you can even get a decision on a visa within 24 hours. So things are adapting and we're adjusting to it. There's obviously been some bumps in the road, but we're definitely moving in the right direction, and people are still able to move over to Scotland.
Frasier, what are your thoughts on the subject?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. And second of all, buckle up, as I'm sure you anticipate. So at the most general level, the US immigration system has been kind of shaken to its core. And there's some numbers I can give you for the UK alone. So the US Department of State's Visa Office, it gives monthly statistics for visa issuances to UK nationals. And to trace to February 2020, there was 190 immigrant visas or green cards issued by the US Visa Office. By April 2020, that had dropped to 5. And with non-immigrant visas, ranging from student to work and tourist visas, February 2020, 6,100. By April, it dropped to 34. So the question is, how did we arrive at this situation? So for people coming to the US, between March and July 2020, all the US embassies and consulates across the world, including those in the UK, were closed in response to COVID-19. So no one could get a visa to enter the US at the consulate. And even if they didn't need a visa at the consulate, UK tourists are entitled to a visa waiver under the ESTA system. They were still prohibited for entering if they'd been in the UK in the last 14 days. And for people inside the US who are trying to renew their visa, so United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, that handles visa services inside the US, they had their own crisis. So USCIS is a fee-funded agency, so it runs its operations off receipts from applications. And because of the massive drop in global filings, they basically said, we're gonna have to furlough 70% of our staff in August if we don't make up for this budget shortfall from relief from Congress. So thankfully that furlough was cancelled in August with last minute intervention by senators, but the agency said budgetary cuts are going to cause massive backlogs and delays in visa case processing. So as you'll probably know, in addition to the consulate closures and agency crisis, there was the presidential proclamations in March and April and June. So they got a lot of press coverage. These effectively banned entry for people seeking to come into the US on immigrant visas, so getting a green card, and a whole range of student and work visas. And as you'll also know, there was immediate challenges to these proclamations in federal court, which has resulted in them being kind of watered down a little bit, and some limited exceptions to people working in trade, specialty occupations. So it's all been a bit of a perfect storm. So you've president diverging paths in handling immigration in reaction to COVID-19. And one of the core promises of the Trump administration was reforming the US immigration system towards a point-based system like Canada, Australia, and the UK. And this would be a big shift from the current US system, which historically has benefited family immigration. There's the time-tested tale of my grandparents came here with nothing on their back, the clothes on their back, and they made it for themselves. That would shift away from that narrative towards one that prioritizes salary, job offers, education, and English proficiency. And critics of the Trump administration have said that all the restrictions are being imposed in reaction to COVID-19 is them trying to crowbar the restrictions they'd like to have for this new points-based system that they can't get passed through Congress because the Democrats hold the House of Representatives. So on the other hand, you've got Biden administration, possibly as of January 2021, you see a major reversal, like a backwards track of the proclamations going all the way back to January 2021. Including the one known as the Muslim ban, which was the ban on travel from 7 Muslim majority countries. So we've got really diverging paths, and we're kind of looking at the outcome of the election in just over a month.
It's going to be incredible. And just before we move on real quick, Frasier, how did you get into practicing immigration law? Can you tell us a little bit of your background?
Sure. So I came to the US at 15 to do a master's degree. I'm at NYU in international law. And to use visa terms, I stayed off the back of that for a year on OPT, got some work experience, worked for a fantastic civil rights oriented project in the US South. And then I had a decision between going back to Glasgow to practice as a prosecutor with the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, that's the equivalent of a DA in Scotland. And I think I'd sort of had too much of a taste of New York and New York life. And as much as I love Scotland, with a lot of nostalgia, I decided I was going to be here. So fast forward, I had a stint in corporate, and then I decided that immigration was my favored kind of field within the realm of business law. So I became an immigration lawyer, and I'm really enjoying it. I think not being from the US gives you a certain degree of empathy for your clients. I'm sure Lynn will experience this in practice as well. Whenever a client calls panicking, you kind of feel like, well, I know how you feel. I've sort of been through this process myself. So.
And Lynn, how did you come to practice immigration law, and how did you come to be in the United States as well?
So I moved to New York after university, and I was doing an internship at a nonprofit at the Multiple Sclerosis Society. And then I had my first battle trying to get a visa to stay in New York. And I was lucky at the time because I was able to then be sponsored by the British Consulate in New York. So I ended up working for what's now the Department for International Trade. And as part of my role there, I was responsible for fostering relations between the UK and the US, and specifically trying to encourage economic development in the UK. And during that work, we would often be speaking with lawyers back in the UK who would be giving advice to clients in America on, how do you set up a subsidiary in the UK? How do you register with HMRC for your tax? And then obviously the visa was a huge part of it. So I was like, oh, this is fascinating to me, especially since I'm, a visa holder in America. Like, it's totally fascinating learning how you get to a different country. So it was then I decided I quite fancy doing law, and specifically immigration. So then I moved to London, trained and qualified, and moved specifically into immigration. And then, as Fraser says, I've now migrated to America on 3 separate occasions. So I'm acutely aware of the anxiety and the uncertainty that comes with moving internationally. So, I think it's spot on. It's about empathy, and it's about understanding what clients are going through. And I think in any job, it's really easy to become complacent because you do it day in, day out. You know the rules, you understand the process, but you have to remember, for a migrant, they've never been through this process before. So it's about trying to break it down and be direct, but explaining the law in a simple terms so that people can get it and feel that it's one less part to be anxious about, because at the end of the day, if you don't have the visa, all the other bits can't fall into play. So yeah, I just love it. I love getting to know clients and going through this journey with them.
Well, we're so excited. I'm really excited about this panel in particular because we have people literally, as you know, from all over the globe tuning in to watch, and the Scottish diaspora is immense, and everybody has dealt with visas and immigration, whether it's going, Americans trying to get to Scotland, UK, like I've talked to Lynn about that several times. And I just think it's so great to have you guys both on here. And because you are the Scottish Business Network representatives, Fraser for New York and Lynn for Los Angeles. So I just love how this global community has come together and really supported each other. So thank you both. So Lynn, can you talk about travel to UK from the US during the pandemic a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think at the beginning I mentioned, the UK has been open since the beginning of the pandemic. So the borders have not closed. Unlike lots of other countries where the borders have closed, the UK has continued to be open. And what they've set up are basically travel corridors, which everybody in Scotland will know about because it's affecting holidays and work and lots of other things. But basically, the UK government's keeping an eye on all the statistics of COVID cases around the world. And depending on where the country sits from a scientific backing, will determine whether or not a country goes on the travel corridor list. And it means that if a country is not on that list, then individuals arriving from those countries will have to self-isolate for 14 days on arrival in the UK. So what that means is that it has had a big impact on people traveling for holidays, etc. If countries are being added, you know, they're normally only being added or removed within about 24, 48 hours. So it's meaning people are having to return from their holidays, which is creating obviously a lot of uncertainty, because if you have to go into a job, into a workplace, and you've just been on holiday for 2 weeks, then you have to self-isolate for another two weeks. It's just impossible. That being said, I think from a migration perspective, so for Americans who are actually looking to relocate to the UK or Scotland, I think people are starting to understand that this is just a new fact of life, and they're aware of it and they accept it. So I think companies are also just factoring in that idea that if you're bringing somebody from overseas, they may have to self-isolate for 14 days. And that's just the way it is. We just need to adapt and pivot with it. And what's quite good is the Home Office has also recognised that. So ordinarily, if you were American and you've got a tier 2 visa to go to Glasgow, you would be issued with an initial 30-day travel endorsement in your passport, and you would have to travel to Glasgow within that 30-day period. But the Home Office have obviously recognised that people can't travel as easily as before, and indeed you then have to self-isolate possibly. So they've actually increased that 30-day window to a 90-day window. So you now have 90 days to travel to the UK, and then also 90 days to then collect what's called a biometric residence permit card, which is essentially your visa identity card. So that's great. And then the other thing to flag, which I think most people are aware of, which is if you're traveling to the UK, you also need to complete a passenger locator form 48 hours before you travel, whereby you list where you're going to be staying so that tracking and tracing teams can get in touch with you.
That's incredible, because, you know, Kelsey and I were going to be there the entire month of September filming with SBN, as well as traveling around the country and participating in the Scottish International Week. We were stuck here in the States, but luckily we have these virtual platforms we can do this. So Frasier, I want to talk a little bit about travel between the UK and the US as well, from your point of view. Do you have anything to add? Yeah,
so sorry, do you mean the UK to US, or you mean UK to US? Okay, so that's, we've got a bit to get through. So there's two issues to consider for people traveling from the UK to US. One is the general closure of consulates, which I mentioned earlier, and the other is these presidential proclamations, which can parse out a little bit more. So for the consulates in the UK, the US consulates, on March 20th, 2020, in response to COVID-19, we had a closure of the US Embassy in London and the US Consulate in Belfast. And they didn't resume any services until July 27th. They had a phased reopening for limited services for spouses and immediate relatives of US citizens trying to get back over, and students. And the effect of that over this gap in these months is this huge backlog of consular appointments, people trying to get, book their appointment at the consulate, get a visa and come into the US. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect is the presidential proclamations, which even if you manage to get to the consulate and with your appointment being booked, this still applies to you. So the first of the proclamations was March 14th, 2020. And that prohibited entry for foreign nationals who were physically present in a range of countries, including the UK, 14 days prior to their attempt to enter the US. So that covers any non-US citizen who is present in the UK 14 days prior. And that would include UK citizens trying to enter on a tourist visa, on an ESTA. They wouldn't have to worry otherwise about the consulates being closed. And there are some exceptions for immediate relatives of US spouses, for example. And the question is, how is this overcome? How can I overcome this limitation for this proclamation? The solution people thought was, well, let's spend 14 days outside, the UK. Let's go to maybe Mexico or Canada, and then come in after 2 weeks in those countries. So that's been suggested as a means of overcoming that proclamation. But in April 22nd, 2020, there was the immigrant visa ban, the green card ban, the one that all the kind of public news coverage came out about. And that applies to people outside the US trying to get a green card to come into the US at an embassy. And it applies to all family and employment-based green card applicants, and it's effective through December 31st, 2020. There are some exceptions. So there's like these national interest exceptions where it's like a healthcare professional, or if you're coming in to do really important research for combating COVID-19, or national security grounds. Then, in June 22nd, there was the non-immigrant visa ban. So that covers all your H-1B, J-1 student, intern and trainee visas, and L and E visas for intercompany transfers. Again, effective through December 31st, 2020, with some exceptions, again, for these grounds, national interest and coming in as a healthcare worker or a doctor to combat COVID-19. So as you can imagine, there was immediately a ton of litigation in federal court, like, you know, private companies, states, universities, suing to say you cannot do this under the pretext of COVID, because there was an, you know, the argument was you're trying to impose a different immigration rule under the pretext of COVID. So one of the most controversial regulatory changes here was the student regulation, which said that if you're in the US and your coursework was entirely online, you had to leave the country during the time that your coursework was entirely online. It caused a huge amount of controversy. 17 states and the District of Columbia and a bunch of universities, including Harvard and MIT, immediately sued, and it was reversed as soon as the lawsuit was filed. So there's this kind of cat and mouse game of court decisions being issued, preempting court decisions, and the government watering down elements of proclamations and making some exceptions for people to get in. And relevant to ScotWeek and SBN listeners, the O1 artist visa, known as the artist visa, and investor treaty visas for people trying to bring people across company offices to the US, they've actually been exempt from the presidential proclamations, but we still have reports of O1 visa applicants being held up or denied at consulates, even if they've overcome the 14-day limitation, if they've gone to Mexico or Canada, for example, on the basis that they don't qualify for the national interest exemptions, that they're not a doctor, or they're not coming in to deal with COVID. So as it stands, the ban on the 14-day presence in the UK remains in place, and the proclamations remain in place till December 31st. And again, it just really depends on the outcome of the presidential election, whether or not they're going to be rolled back in January 2021.
Yes, this is going to be interesting to watch how this all goes down, isn't it? Hopefully it'll be in the best interest of immigration.
Yeah, and I know this was a tangent from our question list, but is there any precedent for trying to look at historical proclamations of visa or immigration travel bans that would help you guys predict, in the next few months or the next year, how it's going to work out with trying to get visas or travel between the US and the UK?
The argument in the US is, back in January 2017, the ban on travel from the predominantly Muslim countries was immediately challenged in court. It got to Supreme Court level, and they said, well, we can't really touch this. This is up to the executive who comes into the country. The executive under what's section 212F of the INA just has a lot of discretion to say no, they can't come into the country, certain categories. So it really depends on who holds the executive seat, who's in the White House, because the Supreme Court has decided they've got a lot of discretion about who can come into the country or not.
Interesting. Lynn, do you have anything to add on that?
I mean, it's an entirely different process in the UK. It's a rule of law that is respected, and we understand that we have immigration rules, and it doesn't discriminate against certain nationalities. So whenever I speak with Frasier, I just feel fortunate that I work in an area where I know exactly where I stand. There's not subjectivity. It's not dependent on who the president is. It's a rule of law that maintains throughout, and we are prepared for changes, and they have to go through a process before they're enforced. So, I just feel fortunate that I deal with UK immigration.
Lynn, so I know I had an amazing conversation with you before. So what are the different kind of visa routes that someone in the US that can take to get a visa to work or to move permanently to the UK?
Yeah, so I think, you know, the UK system is quite a diverse immigration system, and we've got a number of different categories depending on what your personal circumstances are. I should flag though, as a US national, if you were wanting to visit the UK just for tourism or business purposes, you can generally enter the UK for up to 6 months in any 12-month period without requiring a visa. And just as a visitor, you can do a lot of activities which are permitted under the immigration rules. So you could attend meetings, you could do, you could go to a conference, you could negotiate and sign a contract, for example. So there's quite a lot that visitors can do, and unless you have an American who's got a criminal conviction or you know, adverse immigration history, you generally wouldn't need to apply for a visa beforehand. So that's really good. But the general rule of thumb in the UK and pretty much every country around the world is that if you're going to work in a country, you need a working visa. But you know, we were talking about what I like about my job and why I like immigration. Part of the reason I love my job so much is that I get to be nosy and I can justify it. So before I talk about different work categories, I always like to find out a little bit more about the client. And if, for example, they have a personal relationship, that would mean that we could maybe get a visa through a family member, or what their nationality history is, and whether or not we could get an ancestry visa through Commonwealth citizenship. There's a few different angles that you can explore before looking to the typical points-based system and visa applications. But if we don't have, you know, if we're not married or in a long-term relationship with a Brit or a European, or we're not a Commonwealth citizen, then we would be looking towards, typically for our audience, a tier 2 or a tier 5 visa. Now they're sponsored visa categories, so the US national would need to find a company that holds a sponsor license in the UK. They're willing to sponsor you, and you would meet the points criteria. So there's a lot of certainty and objectivity with these visa categories. So for example, you would need to earn points for salary, for your skill level, English language, which is automatic, being American, and for maintenance, to show that you're not going to be a burden on the social welfare. So tier 2 and tier 5 are really popular categories if you've got workers who are moving over to Scotland, to the UK. But failing that, if you're wealthy and you've got £2 million, there is the investor visa. And then we also have a couple of different categories if you're entrepreneurial. So we've got a startup visa, an innovator visa, and then, and Kelsey, what we discussed, which was the global talent visa, which is a great visa, especially, I'm sure there's a lot of members in the audience who are in the creative sector. So if you are someone of exceptional talent or exceptional promise in the creative sector or digital tech sector, engineering, then there's also this brilliant global talent visa available. So I think there are a lot of different options for Americans going to the UK. It's just about thinking creatively about what the circumstances are and which is the best fit.
And so Frasier, if I'm a Scot, what are my options for working in the US, and what are the visas that are available to me?
Sure, so I'm going to switch to a positive shift and imagining a world without COVID. There's no COVID-19, it never happened. So there's a range that would be available to a Scot who is looking to work in the US. There's an F1 category student visa, which allows a period of work after completing your degree. I did this myself. There's J1 intern and trainee categories of visa, which give you up to 18 months vocational experience with an employer. And the good thing about the J1 category with intern and trainee is you don't have to go through what's called the H1B lottery. The requirements aren't as high, and it's quite quick and easy. As long as you can find a sponsor company and an employer who can host you, you're in for 18 months, and it's good for getting vocational training or maybe adjusting to a different visa once you're in already. And then there's the H1B, which everyone kind of knows about. That allows up to 6 months of employment, and the job has to have a bachelor's degree as a requirement in that field. But the problem here is it's every April and May there's a lottery that's run, and you know, it's not the criteria is just this random lottery. It's not really distinguished other than that. Apart from if you have a US master's degree, you've got a slightly higher chance. You're put into a secondary lottery. So again, pertinent to ScotWeek and SPN listeners, the O1, the artist visa, It's got a funny longer name of Alien of Extraordinary Ability, which might seem a bit silly, but that's the full title. And that's for people working in media, arts, music, television, and design who've won awards. They work for distinguished companies. They're coming to the US to work in creative projects. And it's not just for artists, though. It's also available to business leaders and people who've done really well in business. And some people can shift between, say, an E, for example, and they might want to switch to O1 business visa if they've done particularly well in their field. And then there's the L and E, which they allow companies to bring personnel over to the US. And the E in particular, I think as Lynn mentioned with the UK, the US has a similar system where if you invest a certain threshold of money, to memory, I think it's either $1 million or $500,000 in creating 10 jobs, but I need to double check. And yeah, so that's the intercompany transfer ones. And then the immigrant visas. So if you're very lucky, you have the opportunity for an employer to sponsor you for a green card. And they allow, they bring you into the country, you get a green card, and you obtain permanent residence. So that's a bit more rare than the others. Normally what would happen is you come into the US and an employer would sponsor you from within one of the other non-immigrant work visas. So as I mentioned before, the Trump administration, one of its promises was to move towards a points-based system that would ultimately shift away from the family-based system, which, as Lynn said, do they have a relative already in the US, for example, that could sponsor you? Because the current system favors family-based. For example, a US citizen can sponsor their parents or siblings. It's quite a broad reach, but moving to a points-based system gets rid of that, and it prioritizes people with certain language require, English proficiency and degrees and job offers. So again, in the world without COVID, there's a lot of good opportunities for coming in for certain periods of time, and a lot of opportunity for artists and performers to come to the US as well.
That's amazing. And I do believe, because I handle a lot of real estate, and so I've seen this many times over the last few years, but I think that the visa you were talking about, I do think it's 500,000 and 10 US jobs will suffice for that one. But so there you go. So people should be encouraged, I feel like, to try to go work in Scotland and vice versa. Come on over to the United States and work here. And if we can help sponsor you or connect you with somebody who can, we would love to be able to do that and facilitate that.
And so the very last question to wrap up, Lynn, we'll start with you. How is Brexit impacting, and will it impact, do you think, US, UK immigration, if I can talk today?
A massive implication on UK immigration. Brexit is going to change immigration life as we know it in terms of planning, timing, and the cost of recruitment in the UK. So from the 1st of January 2021, free movement between the UK and the EU ends, and we're going to have a new immigration system that comes into play on the 1st of January 2021, and that is going to treat all applicants the same, regardless of whether you're an EU national or an American or a Turkish national. Everybody's going to be treated the same. And the basic position is that from next year onwards, if you want to work in the UK, you will need to find a company that's willing to sponsor you. So that's going to have a huge implication on employers in Scotland who will want to recruit from outside the UK, because they will need to apply for a sponsor license, and then the migrant will subsequently need to get a visa. For EU nationals that are currently in the UK, we now have what is called the EU settlement scheme. So basically, as long as you arrive in the UK before 11 p.m. on the 31st of December 2020, you can then remain in the UK to live and work, and you have until the following June to apply under the EU settlement scheme for either pre-settled status or settled status. But what's really important is if you arrive in the UK from France, Germany, Italy on the 1st of January next year, you will then need to apply for a visa. You cannot just enter as is currently under free movement. So in terms of our new immigration system, there's a lot of rebranding, but essentially the categories are remaining the same with some rebranding and some changes. There are some welcome changes by the government. So for example, under our typical tier 2 worker category, which is now going to be called a skilled worker route, they're reducing the minimum salary threshold. So you can now sponsor somebody at a lower salary rate. They're also reducing the skills level requirement. So under the current regime, you could only sponsor somebody on a tier 2 visa if they're going to be doing a skilled job equivalent to RQF level 6, which is like a degree certificate job. But they're going to reduce that to RQF level 3. So you can now sponsor somebody to do an equivalent of an A-level job. So that's really good because it means that more people can be sponsored under the sponsorship regime. And they're also doing some other brilliant things like getting rid of the resident labour market test, which is a very costly and long exercise for employers. But that being said, it's not going to substitute free movement. So I think for employers in Scotland, it's really about planning now. So if you're an employer in Scotland and you have EU nationals, I think you definitely want to conduct an audit of your workforce, address where your EU nationals sit, think about the skills shortage that it might create from Brexit, and make sure that you have an open dialogue with any EU workers to make sure that they're aware of the EU settlement scheme, that they have the right to work in the UK, they've got that status already approved. And I think for Scottish companies who do not hold a sponsor license, they definitely want to think about applying for one, because as I said, from the 1st of January onwards, if you want to employ a French national, then you will need a sponsor license, and that will come with a cost. If you're a Scottish company and you already hold a sponsor license, then now's your opportunity to do a health check. So check the information that the Home Office hold about your company, make sure the address is up to date, that key personnel are still working for you and are the right people for this role. And then, make sure all your staff are aware of the new points-based system, and think about your recruitment now. Like, should you be thinking bringing recruitment forward and plugging those gaps? So for example, if you were thinking about, recruiting a French or Italian national in the first quarter, maybe get them into Scotland now, so you don't need to then pay for the sponsorship in January. So there's a lot to think about. And I think for any company who's not sure, I think the message is, you need to address it now, make sure that you're not caught short, and that you can make sure that there's no delay in recruitment by having a sponsor license and making sure all your EU workers are protected from a status perspective. So there's a lot happening, but we still have time. We still have time to get on it.
So Frasier, we're hearing that the time is now for people to look over, what their needs are going to be potentially in the future, because January we have these new laws going into effect for you. How can people find you? People that are watching this program and maybe they need to talk to either of you and have a consultation. What do they do? How do they find you? What can you offer in terms of consultation?
Yeah, well, as New York ambassador, New York's this traditional landing pad. It's always been that case, that the first port of call, and people kind of envisioning that kind of New York skyline. So people always think of New York when they think of coming to the US, and that people get in touch at fraser@sbn.scot if they want to talk about any referrals to people in a particular ground of expertise, or if they want to talk about immigration. They're always open to questions.
And Lynn, yourself as well.
Always happy to take questions and have an initial consultation complimentary, and my details are on the site, and my email's lynn@eversageimmigration.com.
Frasier, do you have anything you want to add about Brexit or anything else?
Well, it's just, I think from the US side, there's a lot of pressure to get a conclusion to the US-UK free trade agreement negotiations, which is unlikely to happen before January and before the presidential election. I think both current administrations are trying to score a bit of a win there in coming to an agreement, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen. But one of the issues, or one of the questions is immigration going to feature as an item on the itinerary in those negotiations? And at the moment, we've had a few rounds of negotiations and it doesn't look like it, despite the fact that the Department of International Trade said that it should be part and parcel of a free trade agreement to have provisions helping free movement of people. So notably, in the proclamations, the presidential proclamations, they didn't actually touch the visa categories that were bespoke products of, say, for example, treaty agreement between Australia and the United States, and Canada and Mexico and the United States. They have the E3 visa and the the TN visa under those treaty arrangements, and they've not actually been touched. So there may be some appetite to negotiate a bespoke visa category as an outcome of that to ease flow of people between the US and the UK. But I think we'll need to wait and see what happens at the outcome of negotiations.
Well, thank you so much, Lynn and Fraser, for joining us and telling us more about immigration and visa and what's going on in the current climate with Brexit and the pandemic. We really, really appreciate all of your support and all of your knowledge and wisdom. And we just encourage everyone watching and listening that if you ever do have questions about travels or visas, to reach out to Lynn and Fraser, and their contact information is on the website.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for, we get to see you often actually, and working alongside ScotWeek with SBN. We greatly appreciate that, and thanks for taking the time out of your day to be here with us.